Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
What urban legend legitimately gives you the creeps? The urban legend that scares me to this day is, in fact, one I discovered myself. I grew up in a very small and very liberal village in Ohio that is a hotbed of strange activity. Of all the unexplainable occurrences that I've personally experienced or heard tales of, this phenomenon, without a doubt, still haunts me. 7 years ago, I spent a warm summer evening with an old friend, on our village green, drinking beers and sharing stories of town. He grew up here as well, but he is 20 years my senior, and now a serious family person with a penchant for honesty, to boot. At some point, the conversation turned to village history, and we began to exchange our strangest stories. He became quiet and told me that in his 20s, he and friends, while both dumb and young, decided to break into a dilapidated dorm building that used to sit about 100 feet from where we were as he told the story. They got into a broken window on the second floor, trudged through porn, graffiti, and refused until they bored themselves with self-subscribed spooky antics. So, they made their way to the exit from the building's back door that led out into a small courtyard. R said he was the last out of the group into the courtyard, and just as he emerged, he saw 2 very large black dogs come charging toward them from the woods beyond the village green. He said his friends must have all noticed because they all began to scream and push back into the door they'd just left. Between seconds of panic, he noticed the dogs now calmly sitting either side of a very tall man standing 20 feet from the terrified group. R immediately became angry and screamed at the man for letting his viscous dogs threaten them. Directly after, R described an intense wave of fear that struck him, nothing like he'd ever felt. He could not see the man clearly, only that he was incredibly tall, wore an old trench coat to his knees and a weathered, Stetson-like hat pulled down far over his face. R said there was a thick silence that followed which enraged the pride of these young idiots further, and R demanded the man leave, with many added expletives. The dark-cloaked man moved his head upward slightly and in a gruff voice said, "You should not be put here after dark." R maintains that even in his state of terror, he shouted back more adrenaline-based idiocy, and the man answered, "Why don't you wait and see?" R admitted the words alone gave him a primal fear he's still not able to explain. Then suddenly, in R's exact words, it was as though the man disappeared. Within a second, he and the dog seemed to melt into the darkness. Just, gone. I could tell recounting the story still disturbed him greatly. His hands shook as he held his beer and looked over his shoulder continuously. But what scared me to the core was not the story itself, or the tough construction worker nearly crying as he explained it, but rather the fact I had already heard of the man in the trench coat and his dogs years before, from someone I didn't know. The first time I was told of this ominous man in the trench coat was 2 years prior to our telling me of his encounter. Another friend from town named John, another very sincere community dad, had told me the story of meeting a guardian angel in the forest surrounding the village when he was younger. Again, it was many years before when he was young but even dumber than R. He and another local teen decided to steal from the Forest Preserve's donation box, located within the preserve itself, in a small reception building. The architecture of the building left a freestanding space between a few walls, about a foot across, open inside to the woods. Hippie engineering and false securities at its best. So, John and said friends make their way to the building around 10 p.m. on a fall night when the woods and roads are empty. They snuck their way to the donations without a hitch and loaded their pockets with change. They quickly slipped back to the spaced wall and began slinking their way back outside. John made it out with ease, but quickly realized her friend was stuck. He could see his friend struggling in the wall's crack and they began shouting, whispering to one another in panic. Seconds turned into minutes and John's friend remained trapped. John said he turned his face from the wall crack to the woods for an instant and was shocked to find a man with 2 black dogs standing about 10 to 15 feet away. It scared him so deeply, he felt paralyzed, wanting to scream but nothing came forth. He described the man exactly the same way: tall, trench coat, the hat, the dread, and the dogs. John said he spoke in a low growl, and said, "If your friend can get in, why can't he get out again?" John felt paralyzed with fear and was sure the man or his dogs were about to attack him. Then, suddenly, John heard his friend yelling his name from the wall, and it was though the sound of his friend's voice snapped John out of a trance. John looked to the crack in the wall and then immediately back to the woods, and the man and his dogs were not there. It had only been seconds, and John, still shaking from adrenaline, searched the trees and blackened wood to no avail. John admitted he would have left his friend stuck there at that moment, but just as John made to run, his friend fell out from between the wall openings. John never told anyone that night what he had seen, and though not religious, he explained this encounter as having been saved by a guardian angel. Though, I could see the memory of the man and his dogs petrified John, still, and the delusion of an angel sent to help him was his way of coping. Having heard such detailed descriptions of the man with the 2 black dogs from totally separate and utterly trustworthy sources, I decided to find out who else in our tight-knit community had come across this entity. Goth Dog Walker. I made very basic posters with a crude drawing of the man and his dogs and the simple question of, "Have you seen this man?" and my number attached. I hung them around town until eventually, a few more stories surfaced. A professional cyclist in town named Mike called to ask me about the man and his dogs, concerned something criminal had taken place. When I explained he was just someone people in town had seen and I was curious, he cut me off to tell his story. He said he'd seen the man in the early 90s one night while walking his bike up a wooded road near the nature preserve. He'd hit ice, bending his wheels, and had to make the long climb up the deserted road. As he cleared a corner, he said a man was suddenly only a few feet in front of him in the darkness. It was winter, so the forest is dead silent at night, and Mike had not heard this man approach to any degree. He felt incredibly threatened the moment he saw this man and his dog standing in the forest on the other side of the guardrail, as though they'd been hunting him. He stammered to speak while reaching into his waistband for a small knife and heard the man tell him he should not be out here without enough lights. Mike backed away quickly and began yelling at the man to do the same, while fumbling for the switch on his headlamp. The light stuck directly where the man was standing, and there was nothing there. Even now, night blinded, Mike was sure he'd catch sight of the man or his dogs moving away but saw nothing. He felt he could hear for a mile with his fight or flight kicked in, but he heard nothing. He said he spent a full minute or two coming to terms with what had just happened before throwing his bike into the woods, for a later pickup, and running home as fast as possible. He'd made a police report that night and tried desperately to rationalize. The next day police told him there were no paw prints or footprints other than his own found on either side of the guardrail or anywhere near his bike, that maybe he'd been seeing things, not to worry, etc. But this only made Mike worry more. He kept the story between he and his wife for years until he saw my poster. He was hoping it meant this man with the dogs was at least known to be real, or real enough to finally prove he did in fact see something unexplainable that night. He, at least, received the latter. When I got all 3 of these people together the first time to tell them how their stories connected, it was incredible, to say the least. They connected similar details to each other's stories and felt immense relief to finally find communal vindication in something they'd all kept secret and in terror. I was approached with a warning not long after having put up the posters. As a friend of the Shawnee people, our local chief sought me out and pleaded I no longer seek out the man with the 2 black dogs. I felt instantly how ignorant and vulnerable I'd made myself searching out a nightmare and agreed. For when you choose to peer into the darkness, he reminded me, expect the darkness to peer back. I'm kind of creeped out by the Japanese legend, Kukisekana, the slit-mouthed woman. Basically, she'll walk up to you wearing a surgical mask and ask, "Am I pretty?" If you say no, she'll kill you with a pair of scissors. If you say yes, she'll take off the mask to reveal her slit mouth and ask, "How about now?" If you say no to that, she'll cleave you in half. If you say yes, she'll cut your mouth to look like hers. You can't run away, so the only way to escape is to confuse her, distract her, which can be done by throwing fruit or sweets at her, or by telling her you're in a hurry, in which case she will pardon her manners and let you go on your way. A few years ago, I was at my parents' house alone drinking some beer on the patio at night. They live in the boondocks. Semi-intoxicated me heard a baby crying. It sounded like it was coming from some brush land about 100 yards away, and the cries were so eerie because it was a silent summer's night. I began to go to it, in pitch black, and the crying got louder and more frequent. I have never been so scared in my life, but I kept telling myself I didn't believe in the supernatural and someone dumped a baby out there and I couldn't leave it. It was a cat in the heat. Big white furball prowling around this stupid rock and rubbing up against it. I've never been around cats much because I'm allergic, and I didn't know they even did that. It sounded so human, though. Growing up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, there was a legend about an adulterous woman who was murdered by her husband in the early 1900s. The story said that the husband planned a picnic for their anniversary where they wore their wedding clothes and reaffirmed their vows. During the picnic, he confronted her about the affair and nailed her to a tree using railroad spikes. The legend said that if you were in the woods near the site, she would follow you until you crossed a stream, then she would just stand there sobbing, unable to follow any longer. I spent a lot of time in those woods with friends, and of course our imaginations ran wild. Well, when I was about 20, my grandpa was involved in relocating a cemetery in the area. He said it was boring work except for the time they moved a corpse, in fancy dress that had a hole right through her forehead. This isn't an urban legend, but it's scary and happened in a city. I recently lived in a house that used to be a nursery. There was a shed outside, and I had some cardboard boxes to store. The shed wasn't really a shed, it was a disused outside toilet, and it had a lot of, the weird paraphernalia that just builds with successions of people? That wasn't scary. The walls had drawings on them of sunflowers. I didn't think anything of it at first, thought it was pretty typical stuff for a nursery. But the other wall the toilet rested against had weirder stuff. A line going down to the cistern and writing by that. It was pretty indecipherable, but it did say the words, "Here." And a drawing of a glowing bulb thing. I think that's strange. I looked at the sunflowers again because there was something I couldn't quite place my finger on, something felt a bit off. The sunflowers all had drawn on faces. And then I thought maybe this wasn't a kid who drew them. Because they all had expressions, they had drawn in details of expressions. The black lines of the eyes were slanted so all the sunflowers were looking at who stood in the doorway. And they had drawn in black tears running down their faces. There was a story about a guy in China who kept noticing that some of his food from his pantry kept disappearing. This had been happening for weeks, and the guy was baffled. He suspected that it must have been his neighbor, but he didn't want to confront him without proof. So, he set up a camera one day while at work, and once he got home he watched the footage, hoping to catch the neighbor in the act. But he found out pretty quickly that it wasn't the neighbor. The man watched in horror as a strange woman climbed out from his cabinets and started rummaging through his kitchen, taking a few items, and climbing back into the cabinets where she still was, while he was watching the video. Apparently she had lived in this dude's kitchen for months. I guess the women over there really know their place. I've told this story before, but my dad had almost the same experience back in college. He was living in a house off campus with 5 other guys, and food that each individual had bought for themselves would go missing, so naturally everyone started suspecting everyone else of taking the other's food. Well, they finally noticed that there was a guy that would show up during parties, which this being the 70s there were a lot of, or they'd see around the house from time to time, and since none of the 6 people living in the house were very close besides my dad and his best friend from high school, everyone just assumed the guy was someone else's friend. Well, one day they finally all get to talking to each other about the person they see around from time to time, and it turns out none of them knew who he was. So when they finally confront this person, they found out that the guy had been living in the crawlspace above the garage since before they all moved in 2 months prior. Apparently they all became good friends with this guy afterwards, but according to my dad and the couple friends of his I met who also told me about this person, after they graduated, that guy living up in the crawlspace went completely off the rails a few years later and left his wife and child to go prepare for the Martians' imminent arrival. Baby in the Chair, set in the 1950s to 1960s. A young couple were waiting impatiently to leave on their first vacation since the baby was born. The young mother's aunt had promised to babysit but was 30 minutes late. The young woman called her elderly aunt to find out what was going on. The old woman apologized for her forgetfulness and said she'd speed right over. Since the aunt was only a couple of miles away, the couple decided they'd go ahead and go rather than wait for her and risk missing their flight. 2 weeks later, when the couple returned, they were horrified to find the baby still sitting in the high chair where they'd left it, except now it was dead and bloated, and covered with flies. The aunt really had sped, and unfortunately crashed and died before she made it over. So, I live in Florida and have a very real Florida man type story. When I was younger, a friend and I were riding around our wooded areas in a 2-seater go-kart type thing. Some people call them sand rails. Anyway, we are following well-traveled paths heading towards my house because he's dropping me off. We get lost. An hour went by of us mindlessly going through the woods, and that gave the sun time to set, and it got nice and dark. Now the area we live in is heavily wooded with a few concrete roads with dirt roads on either side of them, all at right angles. The houses are off these dirt roads. We come out of the woods onto the paved roads. Drive a bit and make a left onto a dirt road. It's dark, it's the wrong one, we turn around. Reaching the paved road again, we make a left. As I turned my head to say something to my friend, who was driving, my glance went past him into the trees. There's a naked man sitting on a 4-wheeler looking back at me. Tucked into the trees. I can't make out any facial features, he's got no lights turned on, and he starts to pull out after us. What's crazy about that is he wasn't there before. We only drove down the wrong road for maybe 20 seconds before turning around. He somehow snuck behind us, got all into the trees, and was waiting for us as we came back out. We both panicked and my friend floored it. The naked man keeps following us, keeping just far enough away so I still can't make out anything on him. As we get to the right dirt road we're looking for, a car appears on the other side of the road. It's my friend's parents out looking for us. We're like 14 at the time, and the naked man makes a right and drives right past their car. We make a left. When we got to my house I walked right up to my friend's dad and asked him whether or not he knew that person who was following us. He said they didn't see anyone. It wasn't like some crazy ghost story, and I genuinely don't care if anyone believes me. But my friend and I know exactly what we saw, and it still gives us the creeps to talk about it to this day. This one is verbatim, but just because it's a more towards something that could happen. This girl was home all alone watching TV on a chilly winter night. The television was right beside a sliding glass door, and the blinds were open. Suddenly she saw a wrinkled old man staring at her through the glass. She screamed, then grabbed the phone next to the couch and pulled a blanket over her head so the guy couldn't see her while she called the police. She was so terrified that she remained under the blanket until the police got there. It had shown a lot during the day, so the police naturally decided to look for footprints. But there were no footprints at all on the snowy ground outside the sliding door. Puzzled, the police went back inside the house, and that's when they saw the wet footprints on the floor leading up to the couch where the girl was still sitting. The police officers looked at each other nervously. "Miss, you're extremely lucky," one of them finally said to her. "Why?" she asked. "Because," he said, "the man wasn't outside at all. He was in here, standing right behind the couch. What you saw in the window was his reflection." Urban legends, rather than ghost stories? Not up on my creepypasta bakes, so let's go old school. There's that one about the girl who is driving home late at night and this crazy truck behind her keeps throwing on the high beams behind her, blinding her. Turns out there's a killer in her back seat, and every time he gets up to kill her, the trucker throws on his high beams to warn her. I always check my back seat when I get into my car. Then there's the one about the girl who keeps waking up during the night and doesn't know why, so she puts her hand over the side of her bed to pet her dog, who dutifully licks her hand. She knows everything is all right, so she goes back to sleep. In the morning, she finds her dog disemboweled in her bathroom and a note in his blood that says, "Humans can lick too." There's an old one that bothered me for weeks after first hearing it. Kids won a huge stuffed clown at the carnival. It was like 4 feet long. Got in the way, was always tossed around because the kids would leave it on the hamper, or in front of their closet, or in the hallway. Mom was tired of it, tired of moving it around, so when school started she shoved the giant clown toy in the corner of the laundry room. They can get to it if they want to play with it. Or maybe, the mom silently hoped, they'll forget about it, and she could throw it away. One day she was washing some clothes. She saw the clown stuffed in its corner. Then went over to the neighbors for coffee while the washing machine was going. After an hour, she returned home to put the kids' clothes in the dryer. She did. Then returned in a bit to hang their clothes in their closet. What? Why is the clown on the chair in the kids' room? Whatever must have remembered wrong, and the kids put him there yesterday. Mom runs to the bathroom before getting the laundry basket to take out the other kids' clothes away. She grabs the basket from Kid 1's room and goes to Kid 2's room. Why is the clown on the bed? Wait. Mom definitely saw the clown in the other bedroom. Why is it in here now? His head, resting on the pillow, slowly turns to face her. Get out, get out, get out. Mom runs out of the house and to the neighbors. They call the police officers. Turns out, a little person escaped from the asylum down the road and had been hiding out inside the stuffed clown toy. He pulled all the stuffing out days ago and was just chilling inside this toy all week. The Wendigo. Basically, because my college was located inside a national forest and a lot of my good friends were outdoor leadership majors. We spent many nights out in the woods, had some terrifying experiences ourselves, and had some stories really similar to some of the stuff described in this series. At one point OP describes a person who didn't have a face, who appeared almost out of nowhere and could move incredibly fast. I flipped because I graduated college in spring 2014. During my last semester, my mom was extremely sick with a terminal illness, didn't know it was terminal at the time, and I had to travel home almost every weekend to help with various things. I went to college in rural North Georgia and my hometown was Savannah in coastal South Georgia, so every Friday afternoon/evening I'd run the same route through the sparsely inhabited center of rural Georgia to get home. I was about a 5.5-hour trip one way, and I hated doing it alone. So, one weekend one of my best friends came down with me. We were driving along a long, straight stretch of backwoods highway, just one lane in each direction, and hadn't seen any other cars for at least a half hour. We were about 20 miles past one small town and at least 20 miles from the next small town. There were no streetlights, and the stretch was entirely forested, with no houses, roads, or small private driveways to turn off on. All of a sudden, literally out of nowhere, I saw a man who I could have sworn wasn't there before. He was so close to the car I thought I was going to hit him. I clearly saw that he was standing on the center line, or maybe a foot into my lane. My friend and I both screamed, and I slammed my brakes and swerved to avoid him and stopped. That's when we both realized he was actually on the side of the road, a good 10 feet away, nowhere near the center line. He was facing us, casually, as if we were the point of interest. We stared at him for a few seconds before I snapped back into normal driver mode. We drove off. We continued on our way, but both of us were super uneasy, and we couldn't exactly pinpoint why for a solid minute or two. Then we both realized that aside from his inexplicable jump from the center line to the side of the road, and his appearance literally 20 miles from the nearest town, we both clearly pictured him in our memories as not having a face. And it wasn't that we hadn't looked, either. We both knew he'd been wearing jeans and a reddish hoodie with the hood up. He had brown hair that was long enough that we could see some locks framing the hoodie. But his face was literally exactly as described in the referenced OP story, a blank canvas. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. I never drove on that stretch of highway again. Instead, I opted for longer routes that took me through towns. I don't know if you have heard of this one, but there's an old legend that says if you're alone at night you may get a phone call. If you pick it up, you will quickly find that no one is there. Suddenly, the lights will start flickering. On off on off on off on off on off. If you don't get out of there quick, the walls will start to ooze green slime. And the #slinging slasher will come for you and kill you with his spatula hand. Edit. Okay, reading all these other answers I was reminded of something from a few years back. I'm not sure if it qualifies as an urban legend or not, but there is this monster known as the Agapogo. It's like the Loch's monster, but it lives in Kelowna. Anyways, when I was by that lake I went into it. As in, I looked underwater. And far away in the distance I saw the Agapogo. And it's weird because I honestly don't know if I believe in it or not. So, I had a football coach back in high school who was also one of my teachers for a semester. He told us one story that freaked us all out pretty bad. He had a coaching job at a small college in Montana when he was a lot younger and newly married. He said that after practice one evening, he was making his long commute home, and the route ran alongside just fields and fields of hay, grain, whatever. Since it was late summer/early fall, it wasn't even approaching dark yet. His car was an old beat-up truck with just a bench seat. Anyway, he's driving along when he sees a hitchhiker on the shoulder. This being back in the day and in small-town Montana, my teacher pulled over to let the guy in without a second thought. The man was described as wearing a really old, outdated style of suit. Not quite a zoot suit, but styled in a similar, baggy way. He also had a big, stylish hat. This guy looked like he was out of the 40s, and sort of like a pimp. My teacher thought it was weird that he was so overdressed, it being super hot out. But maybe that was the only clothing he had. So, the guy gets in next to my teacher without a word. Teacher asks him where he needs to go, and the guy just points forward. Teacher drives on. Later, my teacher tried talking to the guy, just trying to make simple conversation, but the guy wouldn't speak or even acknowledge him. He just pulled his hat down like he was sleeping. Out of nowhere, the guy just tips up his hat, looks out the window, and says, "Stop the car, now." My teacher pulls over and lets him out, not wanting to offend a possibly crazy man. The guy stands on the side of the road for a second, and then at a dead sprint, just runs off into the field beside the road, until my teacher couldn't see him anymore. Granted, the crop was fairly tall. He waits there for a while, thinking maybe the guy had the runs or something and didn't want to shit next to the road. After a long enough wait, my teacher gets back in the truck and starts to accelerate back onto the road. The thing about really old trucks is that they don't accelerate very fast. As my teacher got back onto the road, he looked in his rearview mirror to check for a safe merger. But there wasn't a car in sight. What there was was the hitchhiker, on all fours like an animal, running, crawling, after the truck at an inhuman speed. Meanwhile, my teacher is beginning to fishtail as he attempts to go faster. The whole time his eyes glued on the mirror, watching the man chase after his car. Eventually, he was able to get up to speed and lost sight of the guy in his mirror. When he was able to stop at a gas station to use a pay phone, he called his wife at home to tell her the story, and to lock up the house. She thinks he's just messing with her, and he had been talking to her coworker about the hitchhiker. When he asks why she would think that, apparently at her office in the town she worked in, one of her coworkers told her a story of the exact same thing happening to them. And it is a well-known urban legend in that town. She thought it was just folks playing with the new girl at work, who had to drive home alone at night. Anyways, my teacher assured her that he was not lying, and she evidently believes him and can vouch for her side of the story, because she showed up to one of our fundraisers and I asked her about it. So yes, now I just avoid lonely roads in Montana. Asterisk, a lot of you are asking where this happened. I don't think he ever actually told us. But for some reason, I'm leaning towards the northwestern part of Montana. At least that's where I pictured it in my mind. Sorry, I can't be of further help. He told us this story quite a long time ago. Since the 70s and still, today, our street has been known to have the ghost of Estella. If you drive down the street, slowly, with your brights on, there is a hologram-like figure in the road. It looks like someone sitting in a wheelchair. The legend is that it's a little girl who was in a wheelchair. She was hit by a car, and they never found her killer. She now haunts the bottom of the street. To this day you get carloads of teenagers and everyone around town driving down the street slowly with their brights on to catch a glimpse. This urban legend does not freak me out. No. But it freaked my grandma out when I told her about it. The problem is, Estella is my grandma. There are streets all over town that are named after my family, and we live on my grandma's street. This has been going on for several years and she had never heard about it until I told her. LOL. The look on her face was priceless. Not a legend, actually happens. I read this in an article years ago. Inmate in hellhole prison, Mexico or Thailand or some other place you don't want to go to prison, has a lump on the side of his neck that gets bigger and bigger over the course of a week or so. The article is from the perspective of the cellmate. Then one night the man is screaming bloody murder, and the cellmate jumps up to see what's wrong with him. He is clawing at the lump in his neck, which is now pulsating and squirming. A guard runs into the cell with a knife and slices the lump open. Dozens of small roaches, climb out of the guy's neck. Apparently they climb into your ears when you're sleeping and migrate downwards through the skin, burrowing into the neck to lay their eggs. They grow, then hatch and try to get out. That's why the lump began pulsating / moving / whatever. There was this one that is something like this, though I'm sure someone else could tell it better. A woman was driving home at night, and this car following her kept flashing his brights every few minutes. She sped up and he stayed right with her. She freaked out and tried to dodge him, and the car continued to follow. Finally, she pulls into her driveway and gets out, terrified of the car that pulls up behind her. The driver behind her tells her to get away from her car and calls the police. Turns out, there was a man with a knife in her back seat. Every time the man would sit up to stab her, the driver behind her would flash his brights to draw attention to him, and the would-be murderer would go back down. When officers opened the car, there was no one, but they did find the knife in the back seat. After hearing that, I started checking my back seat obsessively before I got in. I still check my back seat when I get into my car at night. I live in a rural area where you don't typically lock your car at night, so it seems plausible in a terrifying way. So, I live in Florida and have a very real Florida man type story. When I was younger, a friend and I were riding around our wooded areas in a two-seater go-kart type thing. Some people call them sand rails. Anyway, we are following well-traveled paths heading towards my house because he's dropping me off. We get lost. An hour went by of us mindlessly going through the woods, and that gave the sun time to set, and it got nice and dark. Now the area we live in is heavily wooded with a few concrete roads with dirt roads on either side of them, all at right angles. The houses are off these dirt roads. We come out of the woods onto the paved roads. Drive a bit and make a left onto a dirt road. It's dark, it's the wrong one, we turn around. Reaching the paved road again, we make a left. As I turned my head to say something to my friend, who was driving, my glance went past him into the trees. There's a naked man sitting on a four-wheeler looking back at me. Tucked into the trees. I can't make out any facial features, he's got no lights turned on, and he starts to pull out after us. What's crazy about that is he wasn't there before. We only drove down the wrong road for maybe 20 seconds before turning around. He somehow snuck behind us, got all into the trees, and was waiting for us as we came back out. We both panicked and my friend floored it. The naked man keeps following us, keeping just far enough away so I still can't make out anything on him. As we get to the right dirt road we're looking for, a car appears on the other side of the road. It's my friend's parents out looking for us. We're like 14 at the time, and the naked man makes a right and drives right past their car. We make a left. When we got to my house I walked right up to my friend's dad and asked him whether or not he knew that person who was following us. He said they didn't see anyone. It wasn't like some crazy ghost story, and I genuinely don't care if anyone believes me. But my friend and I know exactly what we saw, and it still gives us the creeps to talk about it to this day.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe the Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.